Okay, so today we're going to move on to historical myths. So for this slide, we're going to continue the story of Siddhartha Gautama, and we're going to talk about a couple other important moments in Buddhist history. So we're going to pick up the story of the life of Siddhartha Gautama where we left off before. And where we left off before was that, remember, he had witnessed these four sights that showed him that the world is full of suffering, and he couldn't live with his life anymore. He couldn't find joy in his life anymore, even though he was wealthy. He had a wife that he loved. He had a baby son that he loved. But knowing that he would eventually grow old, get sick, and die, and that this would happen to everyone in his life was too traumatic for him. It was too difficult for him to undertake. So he left home, he ran away, and he became a Hindu ascetic. He became basically a sannyasi or a sadhu, like we studied in Hinduism. So he went off into the forest, right? He ran away from his family, from his palace, his kingdom, and he started to engage in ascetic practices. So that's the first word that I have up here is asceticism. And remember from Hinduism, some Hindus choose to become sannyasis or sadhus in order to overcome desire. So remember, the goal in Hinduism is to ultimately overcome desire for anything in this world, and that all we want is desire, or all we want is God. All we desire is God, and that's how we can achieve moksha. So an important way that these sannyasis or sadhus achieve that lack of desire, or come to the point where they don't desire anything in this world, is they deny themselves all the pleasures and luxuries of this world. So asceticism is to deny oneself physical pleasures and necessities in order to progress spiritually, or to create a spiritual experience. So this is what Siddhartha Gautama embarked upon when he went into the forest and lived with other Hindu sannyasis. And according to the stories of his life, he was very good at it. The story says that he got down to eating 1 grain of rice a day. So a major part of asceticism is fasting, right? So eating as little as possible. He also, apparently, he didn't own anything, right? He only had the cloth that he wore. He didn't even sleep on a mat at night. He only needed like an hour of sleep. So he was denying himself more and more the things of this world, right? In an attempt to overcome desire. So one way I can stop wanting the things of this world is to deny myself everything in this world and to get used to that, right? I don't need anything in this world. I don't need food. I don't need pleasure. I don't need comfort, things like that. So Siddhartha Gautama progressed and progressed in this asceticism, and he was very good at it. But he wasn't finding that he was making spiritual progress. Remember, he left his home, he went out into the wilderness in order to overcome suffering. He wanted to find out why we suffer and how to stop suffering, right? How to enjoy life, even though we know that all of these horrible things await us and await everyone that we love. So he found actually that ironically, maybe not ironically, maybe actually very logically, the more he denied himself the things of this world, the more he actually thought about the things of this world, because he was constantly yearning for those things that he couldn't have, right? So specifically food. He found that the more he denied himself food and water and things like that, the more he thought about those things, right? He was hungry. He was starving. So he came to a point where he said, I don't think that this is the way. This doesn't seem to be working. I don't seem to be making any spiritual progress, because it's really hard for me to focus on suffering and overcoming suffering when all I can think of is how hungry I am. So anyone who's been on a diet knows that this is true, right? The more you deny yourself food, the more you end up obsessing about food and focusing on food. So according to the stories, he was thinking about this, he was coming to this conclusion, and right at that moment, a woman came up to him and offered him a bowl of food, right? So Hindu sannyasis, as well as later Buddhist monks and nuns, they beg for their food. Right, they don't own anything, they don't deal with money, so they live off of the generosity of others, and people give them food and take care of them in order to help them on their path and to earn good karma for themselves. So this woman is there, and she's offering him a full bowl of food. And, Siddhartha Gautama, apparently it had been years since he had eaten a full meal. But he said, you know what? I'm done with this. And he says, yes. He accepts the bowl of food. He eats the entire bowl of food, and he feels great. He's full. He's satisfied for the first time in a very long time. And he comes to the realization that this is silly. This asceticism does not work. Asceticism, self-denial, is not the path to spiritual progress or to spiritual enlightenment. So this is how Buddhism comes to a teaching of the middle way. So one major ethical teaching in Buddhism is that we should avoid extremes. Right? Our lives should follow this middle way or this middle path. And we can see that in the life of the Buddha, or at this point, he's still Siddhartha Gautama. So in the life of Siddhartha Gautama, he experiences both extremes, right? His youth is one of complete indulgence. He has everything that anyone could ever want: money, food, wealth, women, entertainment, toys, possessions, all the things you could ever want. But it doesn't make him happy. It doesn't bring him spiritual fulfillment. And then on the other hand, when he rejects that, he goes to the other extreme, right? He denies himself everything. I will deny myself all comfort and all food and all water and all the things that my body needs. And that doesn't work either. So he comes to the conclusion that really the best path is the middle way, right? To just have enough, to just make enough money, have enough possessions, eat enough food, sleep enough, right? Take care of your body, but don't overdo it, right? Take care of your need for comfort and shelter and things like that in this world, but don't overdo it. So Siddhartha Gautama, he eats this bowl of food, he feels great, and basically at that point he says, well, now that I don't need to focus on food, I can focus on suffering, right? I can focus on figuring out suffering and overcoming it. So according to the legend of his life, he sits down under a Bodhi tree, and he vows to not get up until he has achieved enlightenment. So he sits down, he meditates, and there's all these fantastic stories, and you have some of them in your World's Wisdom text. Not all of them are assigned to you, but if you want to read more of them, you can. That during this night, he figures out everything in the universe. He has this flash of insight where the nature of reality, the nature of suffering, the cause of our suffering becomes clear to him. And this is his enlightenment. So in Buddhism, the Buddha's enlightenment was to figure out why we suffer, to figure out why it is that human beings suffer, what the cause of our suffering is, and how to overcome that suffering. So we're going to talk much more in detail about that. This is when Siddhartha Gautama figures out the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Noble Path, which we'll talk about. But basically him becoming enlightened means that he has arrived at the cause of our suffering and how to overcome that suffering. So he figures this out. He becomes enlightened. He becomes the Buddha. And he actually, has this moment where he has a decision to make after he has become enlightened, that he could either pass into full nirvana and simply live a lifetime and after death an eternity of peace and bliss, and we'll talk a lot more about what nirvana is, or he could stay in the world and he could try to pass on these teachings to others. And he's tempted for a moment to just sort of live in this bliss, but ultimately he decides that he wants to teach others. He wants to show others what he has discovered, what he has realized. So we mentioned this already in the historical overview, but after his enlightenment, he embarks upon a teaching career for the remainder of his life, and he basically wanders around India, different parts of India, and he teaches people in different towns and villages that he comes to what he has discovered, right? I have discovered why we suffer and how to overcome that suffering. It's not easy to do that. We'll talk about the path to doing that in Buddhism. But he wanted to share with others what he had done or what he had realized. And he becomes very popular. This is a movement that gets a lot of steam and gets a lot of popularity during Siddhartha Gautama's lifetime, or he's now the Buddha, right? When he becomes enlightened, he becomes the Buddha. And he has many followers. So people, his students, his disciples, they follow him around. They go with him from these town to town. So when he would come to town, there would be sort of, this whole crowd of monks and nuns that would come with him that wanted to follow his teaching. And then each town, he would gain more followers that wanted to do this. And actually, I forgot to mention the image behind me. This is the Buddha's first talk. It's called the Sermon at Deer Park, or the Teaching at Deer Park. And according to the story, after he becomes enlightened, the first people he teaches are the Hindu sannyasis that he had practiced asceticism with. So he had been living in the forest with other Hindu sannyasis. So after he becomes enlightened, he gathers them to him, and he says, I've figured it out. I figured out why we suffer and how to overcome suffering. So he tells them, and they immediately all, see that he is correct. They agree with his teachings, and they become the first Buddhists. So the Sermon at Deer Park is really considered sort of the official beginning of Buddhism, because that's the beginning of this tradition as a movement. And then we mentioned, when he's about 80 years old, he eats that bad meat, he suffers food poisoning, and he does die. But according to the legends of his life, he knew that this was happening. He knew that it was his time. And he also wanted to be compassionate to this man. He knew that this man had killed an animal in order to feed him. That was something that, cost a lot of money for him, was not a cheap thing for him to do. But he was doing it to show the Buddha that he was a guest of honor in his home. So he chose to be compassionate to that man and to eat the food. And then, of course, after it's clear that he has food poisoning and he's going to die, the man who fed them that food, of course, felt very bad. But he assured the man before his death, according to the legends, that he chose to do this. He knew what was happening, so it's no fault of his. He didn't do anything wrong. And he gives those final teachings, and some of those you'll read in the World's Wisdom text. So after his death, Buddhism spreads more. It still continues to be a very popular movement within India, and a lot of that has to do with a man named King Ashoka. This is the next term that I have here. So after the death of the Buddha, there was an individual who did unite all of India. So if you remember back to the prophecy that was given at Siddhartha Gautama's birth, not his death, his birth, the man said that if he embraced the world, he would unite all of India and become the king of all of India. Well, that's not Siddhartha Gautama's destiny. His destiny was to become the Buddha, but that was the destiny for another individual, and that's King Ashoka. So several hundred years later, there was this individual who was a great warrior, a great conqueror, and he did unite all of India, and he became the first king of a united India. But King Ashoka had some issues after this. So after the war was over, the battles were over, and the country was united, he still apparently he had some regrets, and he had a hard time dealing with what he had done during the war and what he had seen during the war. Most likely today we would say that King Ashoka had PTSD. He had a hard time recovering from the bloodshed and the fighting and the death that he had been a part of during the war. And so apparently he feels so guilty about what he's done. He really can't get over all of the killing and all of the death that he was part of and that other people did on behalf of him. That he wants to find a way to make the world a better place. He wants to find a way to overcome what he's done, to make up for all the wrong that he's done during the war. And at this time, he's introduced to Buddhism. So a Buddhist monk comes and teaches him about Buddhism, and he embraces this tradition, right? He thinks that it's It's such a compassionate way of living. It's such a peaceful way of living. And he becomes a Buddhist himself. So he decides that the way he's going to make up for all the bloodshed that he's been a part of to unite India, in order to make up for that, he's going to spread the teachings of Buddhism because he wants other people to learn about this, and he thinks that'll help make society, a more peaceful, a more tolerant society. So he basically funds the spread, the expansion of Buddhism. He pays the salaries of Buddhist monks and nuns. He pays for them to go out into different parts of India and to teach people about Buddhism. He sort of finances these missionary projects, and because of that, Buddhism does become very popular in India. It for a time seems as if it's going to overtake Hinduism. Right? Hinduism is by far the dominant religious tradition at the time, but Buddhism spreads very, very quickly. And some of the reasons that it does spread has to do with the Buddha's teaching of equality. The Buddha rejected the caste system. So if you remember the caste system from Hinduism, the Buddha rejected that. He did not think that it was appropriate, and he rejected the idea that was popular at the time, not very much anymore, but said that actually you had to move up the caste system in order to achieve moksha. So some Hindus believed that only a Brahmin, so only someone from the highest caste, could actually achieve moksha. So you had to work your way up that ladder. So somebody who was a lower caste didn't really have much spiritual ability. But the Buddha did not agree with this, and he welcomed people into his, to become his students, his followers from any caste. It didn't matter. And so a lot of people were very attracted to this, right? Because it was a way of teaching that all people were equal, and it didn't matter what caste they came from. So Buddhism picked up a lot of steam during the lifetime of King Ashoka. It became very popular during the lifetime of King Ashoka. But of course, you probably remember, India is not a Buddhist country today, right? It is still very much a Hindu country. And that had to do with, in one way, Hinduism's sort of flexibility and tolerance and ability to absorb other traditions and other teachings. So if you remember back to Hinduism, we talked about Vishnu and Vishnu's avatars, and that actually many Hindus see the Buddha as one of Vishnu's avatars. So this understanding of the Buddha also became popular around this time. So it was a way that Buddhism really kind of was able to reabsorb back into Hinduism. So people who were followers of the Buddha, who were practicing Buddhism, were able to continue doing that without it ever sort of contradicting with their Hindu identity. So there are many Hindus today, there are many Hindus at that time as well, who follow the teachings of the Buddha, agree with many of the teachings of the Buddha, practice Buddhist forms of meditation, and see nothing contradictory in that to being Hindu and still identifying as Hindu. Because they simply believe that Siddhartha Gautama, or the Buddha, was an avatar of Vishnu, right? He had come to show people a truth about the world, to save people, show them a new way to overcome suffering, and that was the role of the Buddha, was an avatar of Vishnu. So King Ashoka is very instrumental still in sort of spreading those teachings of Buddhism at the time. Okay. Then the last thing for this slide is just a review of these three major denominations of Buddhism, which we talked about a little bit already in the historical overview. So within a couple hundred years of the Buddha's death, we do have the splitting of Buddhism into its two major denominations, which is Theravada and Mahayana. So those are the first two that I have listed here. And each denomination of Buddhism is called a vehicle. That's why it says the three vehicles here, because Buddhism is viewed by Buddhists as a path. It is a vehicle for getting farther on that path, right? If life or many different lifetimes follow a path, then Buddhism is how we move farther on that path. And it's moving towards the goal. right? So in Hinduism, the goal was moksha. In Buddhism, the goal is nirvana. And we're going to talk more about nirvana in our next slide, myths of endings. But the different vehicles are seen as different ways of getting there, or different understandings of how Buddhism can get you there. How can it get you to nirvana, right? From where you are now, wherever you are in your path to achieving nirvana. So Theravadan Buddhism, remember Theravada means the way of the elders. And Theravada Buddhism very much follows the original teachings of Siddhartha Gautama. Right? When he wandered around India for those many, many years teaching, those teachings were eventually written down. So we do have texts that are the original sermons, the original teachings of the Buddha. And Theravada Buddhism still looks to those teachings, reads those original teachings, and tries its best to follow them. And we said, Theravada Buddhism is still widely practiced in Southeast Asia. And where there are Buddhists, because there are Buddhists still in India, it's just not majority Buddhist country. Also in India, Theravada Buddhism is what is practiced. But a couple hundred years after the death of the Buddha, we have Mahayana Buddhism breaking away. And Mahayana is the greater vehicle. And so it's not to be understood greater in terms of better. So it doesn't really see itself as the better vehicle. It sees itself as the greater vehicle in terms of it being larger, right? If Buddhism is this vehicle to get you to nirvana, Mahayana is a bigger vehicle because there is room for more than one way to get to nirvana. Theravadan Buddhism still strictly follows the idea that to overcome suffering, you have to do the hard work. It is not easy to overcome suffering, but there is no one else out there that's going to help you. You have to do that work yourself. There is no God, there's no spirit being, there's no external help. You do it yourself. It is a tradition of self-help. Mahayana Buddhism basically says we all want to get to the same goal. We want to get to the goal of nirvana, but there's more than one way to get there, right? That's why it's the bigger vehicle, because there's room for more than one passenger. There's room for more than one way. So we'll see in the next slide, we're going to start talking about some of the specific differences that in Mahayana Buddhism, they agree that self-help is a way of getting there. You can do it yourself. You can go through the hard work. But there are some other ways. There's a couple other different paths to get there. And they see the differences between these as, even though it doesn't follow Siddhartha Gautama's teachings, a lot of what Mahayana Buddhism includes within it is stuff that Siddhartha Gautama never taught about. They believe that this is where compassion will lead you. If you truly care for all living beings, you will end up with the form of Buddhism that looks like Mahayana Buddhism. And again, on the next slide, we'll start talking about more of the specifics with that. You'll also notice that I have this word Hinayana next to the word Theravada. That's because for Mahayana Buddhists, they don't call Theravadan Buddhism Theravadan Buddhism. They call it Hinayanan. And Hinayana means the lesser vehicle, right? So in their minds, the Theravadan is the lesser, not in terms of worth, but in terms of smaller, right? So Theravada is the smaller vehicle, and Mahayana is the greater vehicle. And it's also important to know Mahayana is more of an umbrella term. So a Mahayanan Buddhist wouldn't say, I'm Mahayanan. They would identify themselves as one of the many forms of Mahayana Buddhism. So for example, Zen is a form of Mahayana Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism, Shin Buddhism. If you're familiar with any of these other denominations of Buddhism, those are all Mahayana. Theravada is sort of a unified tradition, but Mahayanan Buddhism has many different forms, and it sort of, is a logical outcome of Mahayana Buddhism teaching that there's more than one way to get there. There's more than one teaching that will get you to nirvana. So Mahayana does reflect that in having all these different forms of Mahayana Buddhism. And then Vajrayana Buddhism is the diamond vehicle. We mentioned it's also Tibetan Buddhism. It's really only practiced in Tibet, as well as everywhere in the world that Tibetans have migrated to, and it has its own unique flavor, unique aspects to it, because it was sort of merged with the traditional or indigenous religion of Tibet. There was already belief in sort of these spirit beings and things like that was popular in Tibet. And when Buddhism was introduced to it, it sort of, it merged with that local indigenous religion as well. So because it's much, much smaller than the other two in terms of numbers, we're not going to have a chance to talk too much about Tibetan Buddhism. We're going to focus on Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism. But it's important to know what it is, and that it is the third major denomination within Buddhism. Okay, so that's all for this slide, and then next we're going to talk about Nirvana, as well as some of the differences between Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism.